They never knew he couldn't see out of his left eye. The men around him never suspected. His commanding officers never questioned it. The enemy pilots diving toward his gun position never imagined that the person about to end their lives was operating with half the vision nature intended. In the cramped metal confines of a B-17 bomber lurching through flak-torn skies over Germany, or in the shuddering fuselage of a B-24 banking hard over the Pacific, no one looked closely enough to notice that Staff Sergeant Maynard Harrison Smith aimed his .50 caliber machine gun with a peculiarity that should have disqualified him from military service entirely. He turned his head just slightly more than other gunners. He positioned himself at angles that seemed odd until the tracers started flying and enemy fighters started falling. He had trained his body to compensate so thoroughly that the compensation itself became invisible. And in doing so, he became something the war desperately needed but could barely recognize, a man whose limitation became his edge. This is not a story about overcoming disability through inspiration. This is a story about deception, adaptation, and the strange mathematics of survival when industrial warfare meets human fragility. It's about what happens when a man who should never have been in the sky becomes the person everyone else depends on to keep them alive. And it's about the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the heroes we celebrate succeeded precisely because they were never supposed to be there at all. The year was 1941, and America was hurtling toward a war it wasn't ready to fight. Young men lined up at recruitment stations with a mixture of patriotic fervor and economic desperation, the memories of the Depression still fresh enough to make military service look like opportunity rather than sacrifice. The standards were clear. The physicals were mandatory, so physicals. Vision requirements were posted in black and white. 20/20 vision or correctable to 20/20. Depth perception tested. Color blindness screened, both eyes functional. Maynard Smith stood in that line knowing he failed the most basic requirement. His left eye had been damaged in childhood. The specifics lost to time or perhaps never shared. What mattered was the result. Severely limited vision that left him functionally monocular. In any rational system, this should have been discovered in the first round of medical screening. He should have been thanked for his willingness to serve and sent home to contribute to the war effort in some other capacity. But rational systems break down under pressure, and America in 1941 was drowning in pressure. The attack on Pearl Harbor had turned hypothetical preparation into immediate crisis. The military needed bodies faster than it could properly process, and Maynard Smith, understanding the system's vulnerabilities better than the system understood itself, found the gaps wide enough to slip through. He memorized the eye chart, not just the top few lines that anyone might remember, but deep into the smaller letters, the ones that would be used to test his damaged eye. He watched other recruits ahead of him in line, noting which eye the examiner tested first, how long each examination took, where attention focused and where it drifted. He learned to fake depth perception tests with educated guesses based on context clues. He perfected the art of looking attentive while actually tracking the examination process rather than following instructions precisely. When his turn came, he passed. Or rather, the system failed to catch him, which in practical terms meant the same thing. The deception might have ended there. Discovered during basic training or gunnery school when instructors started paying closer attention. But Smith had understood something crucial about human perception itself. People see what they expect to see. A recruit who shows up, follows orders, and performs adequately doesn't trigger scrutiny. Competence provides camouflage. And Smith, despite his visual impairment, proved surprisingly competent. He learned to shoot, but he stood at angles that maximized his functional field of view. He tracked targets by moving his entire head rather than just his eyes, a technique that looked aggressive and focused rather than compensatory. His instructors saw intensity. They interpreted his unusual positioning as personal style rather than physical necessity. Not exceptional enough to draw attention as a potential ringer or someone worth investigating, but solid enough to keep him moving through the training pipeline without raising questions. He was becoming invisible in the most useful way possible, visible enough to belong, invisible enough to avoid examination. By mid-1942, Smith found himself assigned to bomber cruise training for deployment, to the Pacific Theater. This was where his deception could have killed him and everyone around him. Aerial gunnery demanded split-second target acquisition, accurate range estimation, and the ability to track fast-moving fighters through three-dimensional space while your own aircraft pitched and yawed unpredictably. Monocular vision meant reduced depth perception. It meant blind spots. It meant limitations that could translate directly into friendly casualties. But something unexpected happened during live-fire training exercises. Smith's scores didn't just remain adequate, they started climbing. First, his instructors noticed, but they attributed it to natural aptitude emerging under pressure. What they couldn't see was the rewiring happening inside Smith's brain. Neuroplasticity working overtime. His visual cortex learning to extract depth information from motion parallax, from the relative size of objects, from atmospheric perspective and texture gradients. His right eye becoming hyper-efficient at processing information that would normally be distributed across two eyes. His spatial reasoning compensating for missing sensory input through inference and prediction. He was learning to see the way a blind person learns to navigate, through a combination of remaining senses, environmental cues, and cognitive processing that happens below conscious awareness. Except Smith wasn't blind, he was partially sighted, and that remaining sight, sharpened by necessity and trained by deception, was becoming something remarkable. The other gunners on his training crew liked him. He was competent without being cocky, helpful without being overbearing. He had the quiet confidence of someone who had already overcome obstacles the others couldn't imagine. They started asking him for tips on tracking techniques. He shared what he could without revealing why his methods worked, framing them as personal preferences rather than adaptations born from necessity. By the time his crew received deployment orders, Smith had become one of the more reliable gunners in his training cohort. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The man who should never have been allowed near a machine gun was being sent into combat as a specialist in operating machine guns. The Pacific Theater in 1943 was where theories met reality at lethal speeds. Japanese fighter tactics had evolved beyond what American training anticipated. The Zero's maneuverability made it a nightmare opponent for bomber gunners accustomed to shooting at predictable angles. Enemy pilots had learned to attack from directly ahead or behind, minimizing exposure to defensive fire. They coordinated their approaches with one fighter drawing attention while another lined up for the kill. Smith's first combat mission was an escort run protecting a convoy near the Solomon Islands. The briefing had been routine until the moment enemy fighters appeared as dark specks against the clouds, growing larger with terrifying speed. The aircraft shuddered as the pilot took evasive action. The intercom crackled with position calls and warnings, and Smith, strapped into his gun position with a field of view that would have disqualified him from service if anyone knew, prepared to find out whether his compensation techniques worked when lives depended on them. The first Zero came in fast from the 4 o'clock position, tracers walking toward the bomber's tail. Smith swung his gun to meet it, his head turning to maintain his functional eye's line of sight, his hands making micro-adjustments that his brain had learned to calculate without conscious thought. He pressed the trigger, the .50 caliber hammered. Tracers arced out. The Zero banked hard, smoke trailing from its cowling, breaking off the attack run. Smith didn't know if he'd scored the hit or if it was another gunner. What mattered was that his limitations hadn't gotten anyone killed. Not yet, Siaka. The missions continued. Each one added variables his training hadn't covered, whether that reduced visibility and made depth perception even more challenging. Equipment failures that forced improvisation. Fighter attacks from angles that required him to compensate on the fly, literally adjusting his head position to maintain aim while the aircraft bucked and twisted under him. And slowly, without anyone articulating it directly, Smith's crewmates started to notice something. When he called out fighter positions, he was usually right. When he opened fire, the enemy aircraft tended to break off or fall. His kill confirmations started accumulating. First 1, then 3, then 5. The recognition was gradual enough that no one thought to question it. Smith was just a good gunner, one of those naturals who showed up in every unit, someone with reflexes and instincts that couldn't be fully explained. The fact that he aimed slightly differently, positioned himself at odd angles, and turned his head more than seemed necessary, these were quirks, not clues. But Smith himself was becoming increasingly aware of how close he operated to the edge of disaster. Every mission was a high-wire act performed without a net. His compensation techniques worked until they didn't. There were moments when a target appeared in his blind spot, and he had to trust his peripheral awareness to guide his aim. Instances when smoke or sun glare compromised his good eye and left him functionally blind until conditions changed. Near misses that would have been direct hits if he'd had normal binocular vision. He never talked about these moments. To acknowledge them would be to invite questions he couldn't afford to answer. So he adapted again, developing backup strategies for his backup strategies. He learned to use sound as a targeting aid when vision failed. He memorized fighter attack patterns so thoroughly that he could predict positions before seeing them. He established relationships with other gunners in the crew, creating redundancy through communication rather than relying solely on his own eyes. The system that should have screened him out had instead created conditions for him to become exceptional through sheer necessity. By mid-1944, Smith's reputation had grown beyond his immediate crew. Pilots requested him specifically. Other gunners studied his techniques, though they couldn't quite replicate them because they didn't understand the underlying compensation. He was developing a legend without intending to, becoming the kind of figure that military organizations create to boost morale and justify sacrifice. His kill count reached double digits, then 15, then 20. Each number represented a moment when his disability should have mattered, but somehow hadn't. Each confirmed kill was evidence that the rules designed to protect crew safety were somehow negotiable, or perhaps that the rules themselves failed to account for human adaptability. But legends attract attention, and attention was the last thing Smith needed. It started with a photographer who wanted to document the top gunners in the squadron. Smith tried to decline politely, claiming he was camera shy. When that failed, he made sure the photographer caught him from angles that minimized the visibility of his eyes. The resulting images showed a stern-faced gunner with a 1,000-yard stare, which played well for propaganda purposes, but also meant more people were looking at him. Then came a promotion recommendation. Smith was being considered for a commendation and advancement in rank. This required additional paperwork, a more thorough service record review, questions about his background that he'd successfully avoided until now. The medical officer who conducted the routine physical wasn't looking for problems. He was processing paperwork, going through the motions of a bureaucratic requirement. But he was also competent and observant in ways the recruitment examiner back in 1941 hadn't been. He noticed Smith's head positioning during the eye examination, the slight but consistent preference for right side orientation. He ran additional tests, not accusatory but curious. And when the results came back, they revealed what should have been impossible. Staff Sergeant Maynard Smith, one of the highest-scoring aerial gunners in his squadron, had severely compromised vision in his left eye. Function so limited that under normal circumstances he would be considered partially disabled. Vision that fell well below military standards. Vision that should have disqualified him from aerial gunnery duty or possibly from military service entirely. The medical officer sat with the results, genuinely puzzled. This wasn't fraud in any meaningful sense. Smith had performed his duties excellently. He hadn't endangered his crew. If anything, he'd been protecting them more effectively than most. But he also clearly violated explicit medical standards. There was a regulation violation here, even if the practical outcome had been positive. The question became what to do with information that simultaneously proved competence and revealed disqualification. In a different context, at a different moment in the war, the answer might have been straightforward. Discharge Smith with honor, acknowledge the unusual circumstances, move on. But by late 1944, the Pacific Campaign had become a grinding attrition that consumed men and machines at rates that made replacement difficult. Experienced crew members were valuable beyond easy calculation. And Smith wasn't just experienced, he was exceptional. The medical officer took the problem to Smith's commanding officer, expecting a difficult conversation about regulations and standards. What he got instead was a perspective he hadn't anticipated. The commander had flown missions with Smith. He'd watched him work under fire. He'd read the after-action reports and talked to pilots who'd made it home because Smith had kept fighters off their tail. He understood the statistics better than the medical officer did. That experienced gunners had dramatically higher survival rates than replacements, and that removing Smith would mean replacing him with someone less capable. Someone who might get the crew killed while technically meeting medical standards. The conversation that followed wasn't about rules. It was about outcomes. Smith had found a way to do the job despite his disability. He'd developed compensation techniques that worked under combat conditions. He'd proven himself repeatedly in the exact situations the medical standards were supposedly designed to predict. So what did it mean when someone failed the standard but passed the test? The decision was made to do nothing, or more precisely, to do nothing official. The medical records would note the finding, but also note Smith's exceptional service record and the opinion that he remained fit for duty. The paperwork would be filed in a way that made it accessible if needed, but not prominent enough to trigger automatic action. Smith would continue flying. When Smith was informed of the decision, the conversation was brief and awkward. The commander acknowledged that technically Smith had entered service under false pretenses. Smith didn't deny it. The commander said that given his performance, no action would be taken. Smith thanked him. Neither man seemed quite sure what the exchange meant. What it meant in practical terms was that the military had officially decided that results mattered more than regulations when the gap between them became large enough. Smith could continue serving, but now everyone in the command chain knew his secret. The invisible compensation that had protected him was now visible to the people who mattered most. Some burdens grow heavier when shared. Smith flew his next missions knowing that his crewmates had been briefed about his vision. The easy camaraderie changed subtly, not hostility but awareness. They watched him differently now, looking for signs of the limitation they'd been told about. The confidence they'd had in him was now filtered through doubt, even though nothing about his actual performance had changed. He felt the weight of representation in a way he hadn't before. Every mission wasn't just about his survival or his crew's survival. It was about proving that the exception made for him was justified. One mistake, one moment where his limited vision translated into a missed target or a close call, and it would validate every regulation he'd violated. The pressure might have broken someone else. Smith channeled it into focus that bordered on obsessive. He studied fighter tactics between missions with intensity that worried his crewmates. He volunteered for additional flights when others were rotating out for rest. He was trying to build a margin of performance large enough that his disability couldn't possibly matter, an impossible goal pursued with desperate determination. His kill count continued climbing, 25 confirmed, 30. Numbers that put him among the top gunners in the theater. But now each number came with an asterisk in his own mind. Would these kills count if people knew the full truth? Was he actually exceptional, or just adequate while operating under a handicap? The question became moot in March of 1945 during a mission over the Philippines. The bomber formation had been broken up by weather, forcing individual aircraft to navigate through cloud banks with limited visibility and no fighter escort. Smith's aircraft emerged from clouds to find itself alone and immediately under attack by 3 Zeros that had been waiting in ambush. The next 4 minutes contained more violence than most people experience in a lifetime. Tracers filled the air like luminous rain. The bomber's engines screamed as the pilot threw the aircraft into maneuvers it wasn't designed for. Metal shrieked as cannon rounds punched through fuselage and wings. Smith's gun position became the center of a three-dimensional geometry problem, where every angle represented death, and every second without a solution brought death closer. His first burst caught a Zero, banking hard across his field of vision. The fighter's wing root erupted in flames, and it spiraled away trailing smoke. The second Zero came in from above, a diving attack that should have been impossible to track with monocular vision, the angle all wrong for his compensation techniques. Smith moved on instinct and training, his head swiveling to keep his good eye aligned, his hands working the gun like an extension of his nervous system. The zero flew through his fire stream and disintegrated. The third zero should have killed them. It approached from Smith's blind side, using the exact attack angle his limited vision made most difficult. He shouldn't have seen it in time. By every reasonable standard of prediction, that fighter should have put enough rounds into the bomber to bring it down. But one of the other gunners called out the position, and Smith's months of developing backup strategies paid off. He trained himself to translate verbal position calls into targeting solutions faster than conscious thought. He spun his gun to the bearing, acquired the target through a combination of peripheral vision and predictive tracking, and fired before he could fully see what he was shooting at. The zero flew into a wall of 50 caliber rounds and came apart. Pieces of aircraft tumbled past the bomber like mechanical snow, and then there was silence except for the engines and the wind screaming through bullet holes in the fuselage. The crew returned to base with the aircraft so damaged it was scrapped rather than repaired. The after-action report documented the engagement in the flat language of military bureaucracy. 3 enemy fighters destroyed, 1 friendly bomber, heavily damaged but crew intact. What it couldn't document was the moment when Smith's disability had nearly killed everyone, or the moment when his compensation for that disability had saved them instead. Smith's final kill count ended at 37 confirmed, a number that placed him among the most successful aerial gunners of the Pacific Campaign. The number represented hundreds of moments when his monocular vision could have mattered and somehow didn't. It represented a sustained high-wire act performed at lethal altitude with no margin for error. It represented the gap between what regulations predicted and what reality delivered. But it also represented something more uncomfortable. Every one of those 37 kills had been scored by someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Every mission he flew was a mission someone else didn't fly. Someone who presumably met all the medical standards and still might have failed where Smith succeeded. The war created a natural experiment in the reliability of standards, and the results were ambiguous enough to haunt anyone who thought deeply about them. Smith survived the war. He returned home carrying the usual collection of medals and traumas, the visible honors and invisible wounds that characterized his generation. He didn't talk much about his service, which was typical. What was less typical was his complicated relationship with his own accomplishments. He'd succeeded by violating the rules designed to prevent exactly the kind of risk he represented. He'd proven that the standards meant to protect people could also exclude those capable of protecting themselves and others. He demonstrated that disability wasn't a simple binary, that limitation in one area could be compensated for by excellence in others, but only if the system allowed the attempt. But he'd also gotten lucky. He knew that. There were moments during the war when slightly different circumstances would have exposed his limitations catastrophically. A target in a different position, an attack from a different angle, a mechanical failure at the wrong time. The gap between his success and potential disaster was narrower than anyone watching from outside could appreciate. The medical standards he'd violated existed for reasons. Not every partially sighted person could have compensated the way he did. Not every situation allowed for the kind of adaptation he'd achieved. The rules weren't wrong exactly. They were just insufficient for capturing the full range of human capability under pressure. Years after the war, researchers studying expert performance and skill acquisition would become interested in cases like Smith's. How does the brain compensate for sensory limitations? What happens when necessity forces adaptation at the edge of human capability? Can extreme circumstances produce abilities that would never emerge under normal conditions? Smith declined to participate in most of these studies. He'd spent years hiding his disability, then years dealing with people knowing about it, and he had no interest in becoming a curiosity for scientists. He'd done what he had to do, survived when survival was uncertain, and earned the right to be left alone. But the questions persisted because they mattered beyond one man's story. Modern militaries still use medical standards to screen personnel. Those standards are still based on assumptions about what disabilities are compatible with various roles. and those assumptions are still built on statistical averages, rather than individual capability. Smith's story doesn't prove the standards are wrong, it proves they're incomplete. It suggests that human adaptation is more powerful than regulatory frameworks typically account for. It demonstrates that the relationship between limitation and performance is complex enough to resist simple rules. It also reveals something darker. Smith succeeded partly because he lied. He defeated the screening process through deception and then justified that deception through performance. But what about the others who tried similar deception and failed? The partially sighted recruits who made it into combat and got themselves or others killed. The system would never track those cases with the same attention given to successes like Smith. Survivorship bias makes heroes of those who succeed despite disabilities while quietly forgetting those who fail because of them. Smith's story is inspiring precisely because it's exceptional. But exceptions by definition don't prove rules. They highlight the space where rules break down. The bomber crew Smith flew with remembered him as someone reliable under fire, which was the highest compliment they could offer. They knew about his vision problems by the war's end, but it had become irrelevant in the face of repeated proof of capability. He'd earned their trust through performance, which was the only currency that mattered at altitude over hostile territory. But trust based on performance is always retrospective. It can only be given after someone proves themselves, which means someone has to take a risk on unproven capability first. Smith took that risk himself by lying his way into service. The military took that risk unknowingly by failing to screen him out. His crewmates took that risk without knowing they were taking it until after the danger had passed. The ethics of that risk distribution are complicated. Smith put others in danger by serving with a disqualifying condition, but he also protected those same people through his performance. He violated their consent by hiding his limitation, but he also kept them alive in ways a regulation-compliant replacement might not have. These tensions never resolved for Smith. He spent his post-war life managing the contradiction of being proud of his service while knowing it was built on deception. He'd been exceptional, but exception required violation. He'd proven himself, but only by denying others the chance to decide whether they wanted to serve alongside someone with his limitations. The philosophical implications extended beyond individual ethics. What does it mean when systems designed to protect people end up excluding capable individuals? How do we balance the need for standards against the reality of human adaptability? When do regulations serve safety, and when do they merely serve the appearance of safety while excluding unconventional capability? Smith never claimed to have answers. He'd simply done what he needed to do in the moment, adapting to circumstances with the resources available. The question of whether he should have been allowed to serve was above his pay grade. He'd been a gunner, not a policymaker. His job was to keep fighters off the bomber, and he'd done that job better than most. But history has a way of turning personal stories into policy arguments, and Smith's story became ammunition for various causes. Disability rights advocates cited him as proof that artificial limitations harm everyone. Military traditionalists cited him as an exception proving the rule that standards exist for good reason. Medical professionals analyzed his compensation techniques for insights into neuroplasticity. Policy wonks debated the balance between inclusive opportunity and necessary restrictions. Smith himself remained mostly absent from these debates, which might have been the wisest choice available to him. The meaning of his service belonged to history now, subject to interpretation and reinterpretation according to changing concerns and values. What had been a desperate improvisation to him became a data point for others. The Pacific Theater where Smith earned his reputation was itself a story of improvisation and adaptation. The war there was fought at distances that strained logistics, with equipment that often proved inadequate, by crews learning on the job because training could never fully prepare them for combat reality. Standards existed, but survival required going beyond standards. Regulations provided structure, but victory required breaking structure when circumstances demanded. Smith's monocular gunning technique was part of that larger pattern, individuals finding ways to exceed what systems predicted they could accomplish. The men who kept damaged bombers flying through mechanical improvisation. The navigators who found their way home through storms using instinct and partial instruments. The pilots who landed aircraft that should have been unflyable. The war was full of people doing things they weren't supposed to be able to do because failure meant death, and death concentrated the mind wonderfully. In that context, Smith wasn't really an anomaly. He was typical of something exceptional. The human capacity to adapt when the alternative is unacceptable. His blindness in one eye was just a more visible disability than the invisible limitations everyone carried. The fear, the exhaustion, the trauma that accumulated with each mission, these were disabilities too, just not ones that showed up on medical examinations. Everyone was fighting impaired. Smith's impairment just happened to be measurable. The last mission Smith flew was in August of 1945, days before the Japanese surrender. It was a routine patrol that encountered no enemy contact, the kind of flight that would have been forgotten except that it represented an ending. The war was concluding. Smith's unlikely career as a half-blind aerial gunner was concluding with it. He climbed out of the aircraft for the final time knowing something the others didn't. This was the last time his deception would matter. The last time he'd operate in the space between regulation and reality. The last time his compensation techniques would be the difference between capability and disability. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, it was complicated. The war had given him a purpose that validated his existence, despite the limitation that defined him. Combat had been terrible, but it had also been clarifying. He knew what he was worth when tracer fire filled the sky. He had no idea what he'd be worth in a world at peace. Like many veterans, Smith found the transition to civilian life difficult, but his difficulty had an extra dimension. He'd spent years proving that his disability didn't matter in combat. And now he faced a world where that disability did matter for most occupations. Smith violated rules for what he believed were good reasons, and the results justified his choice without quite vindicating it. The system failed to screen him out, which was either a catastrophic breakdown or an accidental mercy, depending on perspective. He served with distinction while representing exactly the kind of risk medical standards existed to prevent. What his story does offer is a reminder that the relationship between human capability and bureaucratic prediction is more fraught than either side typically acknowledges. Systems need standards to function at scale. Individuals need flexibility to demonstrate capability that doesn't fit standard patterns. The tension between these needs is permanent and probably unresolvable. Smith navigated that tension by becoming invisible until he couldn't, then becoming undeniable once exposed. He found the gaps in the system, exploited them, and produced results that made the exploitation defensible, if not quite defensible. He took a risk with other people's lives by serving with a disqualifying impairment, then protected those same lives effectively enough that the risk appeared justified in retrospect. That retrospective justification is doing heavy lifting. We can tell Smith's story as inspiring because he succeeded. And says, if he'd failed catastrophically, getting himself and his crew killed because his impaired vision left them vulnerable at a critical moment, we'd tell a very different story about the importance of medical standards and the dangers of deception. But he didn't fail. For reasons we can partly explain through analysis of compensation techniques and neuroplasticity, and partly attribute to luck and circumstance, his disability never translated into the disasters it should have caused. He remained capable throughout his service, protected his crew consistently, and accumulated a kill record that marked him as exceptional rather than merely adequate. And then he came home, lived a normal life, and faded into the background of history. The man who'd been extraordinary under conditions that should have exposed his limitations became ordinary once those conditions ended. The half-blind gunner who defied medical standards and enemy fighters became just another veteran, with a complicated relationship to his own service. That ending might be the most significant part. Smith's story didn't conclude with vindication or tragedy. It concluded with the prosaic reality that most lives move toward regardless of what extraordinary moments they contain. He'd been tested under lethal pressure, proven capable despite limitation, and then returned to a world where that proof mostly didn't matter. The bombers he flew in were scrapped or sold. The crews he served was scattered across the country. The fighters he shot down rusted in Pacific jungles or sank beneath Pacific waves. The whole vast machinery of industrial warfare that created the circumstances where his specific adaptations proved valuable dismantled itself with surprising speed once the war ended. What persisted was the question his service raised: how do we measure human capability? What do disabilities actually disable when circumstances change? When do standards protect and when do they merely exclude? Who decides which risks are acceptable and who bears those risks when decisions prove wrong? Smith didn't answer these questions. He simply lived them, navigating the contradiction between regulation and reality with determination and deception in roughly equal measure. His legacy, such as it is, exists in that navigation, in the proof that sometimes the person least likely to succeed by bureaucratic standards becomes the person most worth having when survival hangs in the balance. They never knew he couldn't see out of his left eye until it no longer mattered. And by the time it no longer mattered, he'd already proven what he needed to prove. The rest was just paperwork, memory, and the long, slow fade that claims all wars eventually. He'd been exceptional when exceptional was needed, ordinary when ordinary was possible, and complicated throughout, because human beings resist simple categorization even when systems demand it. That complication is the point. That's what makes the story worth telling and worth contemplating. Not because it provides easy answers, but because it illuminates the questions we still haven't resolved about capability, limitation, inclusion, and risk. Maynard Smith flew his missions and came home alive, carrying with him evidence that our certainties about human limitation are less certain than we believe, and that sometimes the person who shouldn't be there is exactly the person who needs to be.